Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Peter Florence, and this, as I think you know, is Stephen Fry. I have a couple of housekeeping things to say. Firstly, would you all please, at the end of this session, turn your mobile phones back on and tell anyone you want to how great it's been. I also need to say hello to the people joining us online. Good morning to the people in California. Good evening to you Europeans. We love you, honestly. And I would offer a literary Hawait, or maybe in honor of my friend, a Woodhouseian what-ho, or a good morrow to the people watching in Trivandrum and in Auckland. Thank you very much for joining us online. This is a great thrill to be in this building. This is the first edition of The Conversation, which is a format that starts with the idea of a conversation that happens up here on this stage, and then in the second hour we travel downstairs into the crypt and join tables and continue the conversation over whatever kind of drink you might like to have. The crypt is one of the best bars in London. Can't recommend it highly enough. We are predicating this series upon the idea of using super articulate people who are writers to talk about the biggest issues that we see confronting the world. The alarm and anxiety about artificial intelligence, the threat of climate change, conflict resolution, the vulnerabilities of democracy, and I think possibly most of all, the idea of equalities. We are sitting here in this extraordinarily beautiful church, which is, among other things, the home of Amnesty International, of Liberty, of the Pride movement, of, perhaps most famously, of all the homelessness charities, Shelter. This is not only the parish church of the establishment, both the Houses of Commons and the Lords and the Buckingham Palace complex all fall within this parish, but it's also the birthplace and one of the engines of some of the most spectacular and progressive activisms and social justice movements that we know. So we're thrilled to be here and delighted to bring a bit more literary conversation to the table. So we are going to talk about artificial intelligence. We're going to talk about equalities, and the idea with artificial intelligence, I think, is to try and find the human being with the most humane wisdom you can to address it, and here he is.
Sorry.
But before we drill into robotics and machine learning and yada, 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 I just want to celebrate for a second and invite Stephen to talk a little bit about how, in his pomp and prime, he's gone back with his last 3, now 4 books to classical antiquity, to Greece. And Stephen, A, thank you for being here. B, let's get to it. What's taken you back to Greece now?
It's really interesting. I've just finished the 4th one, which is Odyssey. And as people may know the story of the Odyssey, it's the 10-year return home from the Trojan War of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, the most wily and subtle and cunning of all the Greek warriors who went to Troy. It was his idea to leave the wooden horse outside the city, which is what turned the battle their way. And his journey home, his Odyssey, is in Greek. There's a wonderful word, nostos, which means the journey home of the hero and all the problems that get in the way and the longing behind it. And in the 17th century, a Swiss academic took the word nostos and added it to the Greek for pain and came up with the word nostalgia, which we use all the time for that sense of a place we belong to, nowadays more often a time than a place, and our yearning for it. And I suppose to some extent I had a feeling of nostalgia, a longing for reacquainting myself with the excitement I felt when I was a child and I first read about Achilles and Athena the goddess and Ariadne and all these amazing stories that lit me in a way that others didn't especially. I had friends who read war comics and talked about nothing but football, but in those days I was much happier burying my head in Robert Graves and a writer called L.S. Hyde and a few other of these marvelous retellers of the myths. And about 7 years ago, I was at a party and there was a group of us chatting, and for some reason, the subject of where gods came from came up. I promise you this isn't normal party conversation for me. So I mentioned how wonderful the story of Uranos, I shall call him, rather than Uranus, and his castration at the hands of Kronos, and then the defeat of Kronos by his last son, Zeus. And they all stared at me as I told these, I think, fantastic stories. And they said, how do you know this? And I said, well, I just sort of dimly remember it from childhood. Don't you remember? And they said, yeah, but most of them had forgotten. And for some reason, I hadn't. And I looked in a library and saw that no one in English that I had come across had retold those stories for a very long time. There were comic strip versions where, Theseus, calls the Minotaur dude and things like that, which are very much for young people and are quite fun. But there wasn't anything that I came across that I would have fallen on, like a lion falling on an antelope, when I was, 11, say. So I started writing about the birth of the gods. And the other beauty of the Greek myths is that they have a shape. Partly, I think, because the alphabet arrived in Greece from the Phoenicians at just the right time for them to be able to set down permanently the stories that the word they use was rhapsode, their bards, like Homer, had been telling these stories, and they'd been passing from hand to hand, from mouth to mouth, and had never been written down because there was no alphabet. But the Phoenicians invented this extraordinary system whereby no matter what language you spoke, you could represent it in symbols that stood for sounds. That had never happened. It's the most important moment in our history up to that time. In fact, it began history. If you talk about history, all history begins with the written word. Anything before that is called prehistory or archaeology. But as soon as you were able to write things down, and it doesn't really include the Egyptians because their hieroglyphs were not sound-based. You wouldn't know how to say an Egyptian hieroglyph, and no one did until the Rosetta Stone. But anyway, that marvelous moment that allowed the alphabet meant that the myths could be written down. And so they, unlike many other myths, they have an almost literary shape because of Hesiod and Homer, and then, of course, later on, the great three tragedians, Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles, who turned them into marvelous plays as well. And I suppose this is a way of sliding into artificial intelligence. One of the things that astonished me is that the Greek mind, the human mind, we mustn't overprivilege the Greeks. They were at the right place at the right time, and they were magnificent in what they have given us. Firstly, Pandora's box. It should technically be a jar, but you probably know the story of how this first woman was created, and Zeus gave her this jar, and it had a lid on it, and he said, you must go down, and she was to marry Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, who created humankind. And he said, whatever you do, don't take the lid off. She said, no, of course not. It's one of those mean, rather misogynistic creation myths like Adam and Eve, where it's all the fault of the woman, which I apologize for, but it's not my fault. Anyway, of course, she can't resist opening it, and out come all the troubles of the world. She slams the lid back on, not realizing there's one little creature left inside, Elpis, which is the Greek for hope, which is a very grim idea, but that's how all the misery and terror and disease and warfare and lying and abuse, all the bad things in what had been a golden age appeared, and we were from then on corrupted. So it's in a sense similar to the Hebraic myth of the Garden of Eden. But I remember thinking in about 2004, maybe, I had been from a very early time, the late 80s, obsessed with this new technology that became the internet. It was online services like CompuServe in America Online, Oracle, Delphi. Funnily enough, they had very Greek names. And then Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, and the thing really took off, 93, 94, 95, right up to the late 90s, the invention of Google, and then in the 2000s, social media appeared. In about 2005 or 6, Facebook began in small ways, and Twitter the year later. And it was, I thought the internet, in my naivety, was the solution to all the world's problems. The boundaries and borders between us would melt and dissolve, that we would start to understand each other and believe in each other, and goodness would spread, understanding would spread, and all the intolerances and miseries of the world would disappear, because this internet was all gifted. It had all the gifts. It was cinema, theater, libraries, town squares, museums. Yes, like any city, it had its red light districts, shall we say. It's areas you wouldn't want children to go in after dark. But it was a real city, not a Milton Keynes. It wasn't planned. It was a real organic place, but everybody could be in touch with everybody else. And as I say, I had this belief. And the Greek for all gifted is Pandora. That's what she was. And at some point in the early part of this century, the lid came off, and all the malware and the grooming and the wickedness and the abuse and the intolerance and the ghastliness that tainted the whole system came out. And I thought, yeah, the Greeks understood it. They understood that when there is a good idea, it will be corrupted. Since we're in a church, Thomas Cranmer understood it in his wonderful introduction to the Book of Common Prayer, which is one of the most beautiful pieces of writing in English. He says, "There was not anything by the wit of man devised that hath not been in time, in part or in whole, corrupted." And that's how he begins the Book of Common Prayer, which is a very daring thing for him to have done. And the longer you live, the more you realize that is true. And Twitter, for example, which in its early days when I first joined it was like a beautiful bathing pool. It was a lovely place where you could all swim around and chat to people. And then suddenly you noticed the odd turd floating on the surface and broken glass and rusting prams tearing your feet when you tried to settle down. And then really the whole thing became intolerable and you could no longer swim in it. But the really extraordinary myth, I think, that sounded very King Charles, I think, is Prometheus himself. He was a Titan. His name means forethought. And he made us out of clay. He made all the humans, just the males, because this was before Pandora, because he and Zeus thought that it would be nice to have toys, creatures of Prometheus, as Beethoven put it. He wrote a whole ballet on it. And he made us, and Athena and Zeus breathed into us and gave us life. And Prometheus adored us. He was our champion. He made us and he loved us. And Zeus loved us, but he said, as long as they pray to us and make sacrifices to us, they can do what they like, but they can never have fire. Fire was in heaven, controlled by the god of fire, Hephaestus, who the Romans called Vulcan, where we get our name, volcano. And Prometheus said, why can't humans have fire? And by fire, it's very obvious in the myth, it means both literal fire, the fire that roasts and toasts and melts and smelts and gives technology and allows pottery and bronze and then iron and other such things, but also the divine spark, the creative spark, the self-consciousness that makes gods different from animals. And Prometheus disobeyed Zeus and went to Olympus and took a fennel stalk and lit it and took the glow all the way down the mountain and gave it to mankind. And sometime later, Zeus looked down and he saw these little pockets of flame and he knew he'd been disobeyed. His punishment of Prometheus was quite terrible. He chained him to the Caucasus Mountains. And Prometheus, being a Titan, was immortal. So every day, an eagle would come and tear out Prometheus's liver and eat it in front of him. And overnight, it would regenerate and regrow, and the same thing happened forever and ever and ever. Because he had taken our side against the gods and given us self-consciousness and an equality to the gods. And Zeus was right. Once we had fire, both technically and inside us, this strange self-consciousness that separates us from animals, we no longer really needed the gods. And this happened again, and we called it the Enlightenment. It was when we found our fire again after centuries of the Dark Ages and ecclesiasticism dominating mankind in Europe. We found our fire again, and very interestingly, within about 3 years of each other, Beethoven wrote The Creatures of Prometheus. Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound, which is a dialogue between Zeus and Prometheus on the mountain. Why did you do it? Why did you set man free? And most famously, Shelley's wife, Mary Shelley, wrote Frankenstein, whose subtitle is A Modern Prometheus, because suddenly mankind remembered that we are in charge of ourselves. We have our own spark. We don't need the gods. Now, that's one thing, but the most extraordinary thing is that now we are in just the same position as Prometheus and Zeus. We have created entities, as Prometheus did. We call them AI, robots, bio-augmented entities of some kind. And we're not there yet, but we believe we seem to be very close to a time when, like Zeus and Prometheus, we will have before us a choice of making these entities self-conscious, so intelligent that their intelligence surpasses mere problem-solving abilities, mere stochastic repetition, and gives them a kind of consciousness like us. And some of us will be Prometheus and say, let's do it. These are our creations. Let's give them life. And others will be like Zeus and saying, no, if we do, they'll just get rid of us. They got rid of the ancient gods. You go to Olympus now, it's just rubble. No gods there anymore.
Some also might be like Midas, who made the fatal programmer error of not asking for the right thing.
Yes. That's very true. Yes, a lot of philosophers and writers on the subject of AI have pointed out that, I mean, they call it the paperclip problem, that you might ask an AI, if you ran a paperclip factory, that it's tasked with making the most paperclips that it is possible to make. And you ask it rather lazily. The AI looks at the world and thinks, there are a lot of carbon-based life forms getting in the way of what should be just factories and warehouses for paperclips. So without thinking, they simply get rid of humanity because it's the problem of paperclips. Elon Musk, as part of his, his project against what he calls the woke virus, I suspect, but he has suggested that it could actually be the solution to climate change that an AI would come up with, would instantly be the destruction of humanity. If you just said to an AI, we need to solve the problem of climate change, pollution, and everything that's going wrong with the environment, can you do it as a matter of urgency? And it would just go, you're gone. And that would have solved it. So yes, we have to be very careful about the questions.
Can we give the whole AI question a bit of context.
Yes.
Let's start, as one always should, with Ada Lovelace.
Yes.
Back in 1843, she posited to her mate Charles Babbage that machines would be able to do anything that we correctly instructed them to do, thereby identifying the central.
Yeah, she was the daughter of Byron, the poet, Ada Lovelace, and a brilliant mathematician. And she met this remarkable English fellow called Charles Babbage. And I've always wanted to be a composer for the simple reason that Ada and C. Babbage are all notes of the Western scale, A to G. So you could have a tune that was ADA, CBA, BBA, At least I think you could. I'm not musical enough to know, but I should maybe commission a composer.
This is one of those artificial intelligence moments.
Get an AI to do it. Yeah. Ada Lovelace, yes, she wrote down on paper essentially what was to be the project of computer programmers ever since. And a couple of people in the 20th century were absolutely crucial for moving that forward. One was an American called Claude Shannon, who is known as the sort of father of the information age. And he, and a few others, took the work of an Irish-English mathematician called Boole, who is probably best known at school for Boolean algebra, Venn diagrams, and then a system of logic in mathematics that uses English operative words like and, or, exclusive or, not. So if a thing is not this, but that, you can describe it in a Venn diagram way or in this Boolean way. And Claude Shannon thought you could do that with this new science that has happened at the place he ran, which was called the Bell Labs, still there in New Jersey. I've been there. It's an amazing place to go because the Bell Labs was founded by Alexander Graham Bell, who won the Napoleon Prize that had been established by the first Napoleon, the emperor, and was given to Alessandro Volta, whose name lives on in the vault, and who invented the battery, which Napoleon rightly thought was an important invention. So he gave him this enormous prize. It was given a few times, and then it was reinstituted in the 1880s and given to Alexander Graham Bell. And Bell was making enough money from the Bell Telephone Company to say, well, I'll put all the money in research. So he built this laboratory, the Bell Labs. And the Bell Labs came up with all kinds of important things. Sound for film was first developed, the Bell Labs. But most importantly, a man called William Shockley invented a little three-legged device that after a competition within the Bell Labs that all the workers there were allowed to vote was called the transistor. And this gave rise to the science of electronics and electronic circuits that could do things much better than the old tubes. Anyway, Shannon saw that you could use electronic circuits like Boolean algebra as gates for logic, so that you could express logic in an electrical circuit, which is an extraordinary idea. And this, to bright people, brighter than most people we're likely to meet in our lives, but one of them, of course, was the great English mathematician, Alan Turing, who met Claude Shannon. They spent a weekend together when Turing was sent over in the war to swap intelligence with Shannon, and we gave them the magnetron, which was one of the first inventions that was considered like an electronic thing, and that had been invented in Birmingham, in fact. And Turing and Shannon talked about an idea that Turing had had for a machine. And Turing had had this idea to solve mathematical problems, that not to use the machine to solve them, but as an analogy to solve a particular problem in mathematics that couldn't be solved unless you had the breakthrough that Turing had, was if you imagine a machine that can say yes or no to things and keep doing it without tiring, you could find the answer to this problem. And this was called the Turing machine. It was essentially became what we call a computer. And he and Shannon and von Neumann, the Hungarian mathematician who went to America, between them essentially laid down the possibility of using mathematics and electronics to answer questions, to solve them. And Turing had such an extraordinary mind, he even imagined that these things could develop a kind of intelligence. And at a time before they could do almost anything, he already devised what is known as the Turing test. And the Turing test imagines you or me, in his day, was typing out on a piece of paper and passing the piece of paper into a room that you couldn't see, and another piece of paper would come back to you answering any question that you put on it, and you would have a conversation through typed pieces of paper. Well, now you can do the Turing test, of course, simply by using the microphone on your computer, and the computer can answer you in a voice like Siri or Alexa or any of the other voices that computers choose. And the Turing test is, do you know it's a computer by the answers it gives? Can it fool you that it is human? And it's a test both of the computer and of the intelligence of the human being. What kind of questions do we ask a computer in order to tell that it is a computer, not a person? It's a bit like the resistance questions, you know. If you were Dutch, you would ask a German, if you suspected one of your resistance group might be German, not Dutch, you would get them to say the word Scheveningen, and if they couldn't say it, then they must be German. Or, I always imagined if you were doing that in Britain, you'd say to someone, who's your favorite Blue Peter presenter? And if they said, I don't know what you mean, you go, ha, you are not British.
Or indeed anyone but Valerie Singleton.
Yes, it would have to be Valerie Singleton. But so that, and that, all the time I was first interested in AI, which was back in the 70s when there was an amazing fellow called Marvin Minsky, who is known as the father of AI. People are always called the father or the uncle or the godfather of AI, but he was the one who sort of laid down some of the first rules of what AI might be at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he makes you think, and I think what's so exciting about AI, even if it's a dead end, which unfortunately or fortunately it isn't, is it makes you question what our intelligence is. You know what I mean? It's a bit like what the church had to go through in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. It had to keep redefining the limits of its knowledge. At first, the church knew everything. It knew how the universe was created by God in 7 days. It knew what man was for, what man's rules were, you know, what you should do, what happened when you died. All these things could be answered by the church. But slowly, science and free inquiry reduced the island on which the church stood. And similarly, our intelligence, which we think of as this unique, remarkable thing, is being reduced by AI because it's doing things that we can do, but it's doing them faster and better. And we're saying, yes, but that's not real intelligence. That's just being a parrot, and that's just using Bayesian logic to answer and seem smart. Well, I sometimes think my intelligence is a pretense. It's pastiche. It's imitation. The imitation game, as you know, was the phrase that Turing used and was the name of the film that ended it coming back.
I mean, you're a remarkable and perfect example of the one thing that almost no computer has ever done. Not could do, but has never done. If you accept that computational power and capacity is increasing at breathtaking speed, and AI will be able to do any kind of diagnostic machine learning term instantly.
Yeah.
It's very good at predicting probabilities and likelihoods. What it can't do is give the unpredictability that generates laughter. Mm-hmm. Like, it can't do comedy. No. It can't do physical attraction. It can't do all those human senses, those profoundly unmathematical things that we do. And no matter how good the face recognition becomes, it won't, I don't think anytime soon, evolve, if evolve is even the right word, or develop, or be programmed to have a human reading of another human face and what that face might be telling you about that person's intentions.
Ooh, I'm not so sure about that particular aspect. I think the miniature movements of the eye and so on that we are not conscious of, that we often use in order to judge, or indeed the memories. I mean, there are a lot of theories about how it is we have an instinct about another person. And perhaps the most convincing is that it's a memory, that we once had a school teacher who was really unpleasant, and they had a particular mannerism of looking sideways out of their eyes or something that we've never thought about. And 40 years later, you meet someone who has a similar mannerism, and you go, I don't know why, I just didn't like that person. But that seems to be the reason. Well, that's something an AI would be very good at, because you're absolutely right in terms of diagnostics. I mean, I remember making this point when I gave a lecture on AI at Hay-on-Wye in 2016, I think it was. And I said to the audience, and I got in real trouble because a woman came up to me afterwards, furious with me. I said, if you've got children, there are one or two things I would recommend they don't study, and radiology is one of them. It's 8 years, you have to become a doctor. It's very, very hard work, but there is an example of where an AI is already, I mean, if you think of mammograms, you have a machine that has access to every mammogram ever taken and its results, and it can examine every nanometer of its surface for lesions and come up with an answer, and it can do it hundreds of times a second and never get bored, never get tired, never lose concentration. Put that against a human being whose husband behaved like an absolute idiot that morning, whose children are in trouble, and she's looking at it. I'm not saying radiologists are lazy or anything, but they're likely to get tired. And actually, in a very short time, we'll look back on jobs like that, and we won't be even slightly sorrowing that they're gone. The equivalent is, in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, a long time before railways were invented, we had to move coal and manufactured goods around England, and the supreme answer, and a brilliant one it was canals. There's so little effort, just a horse plodding along can draw a vast barge of coal, as long as it's straight and flat, which water is always flat, as long as you've got your locks and weirs, but they have to be dug. And so we brought over all those Irish labourers to navigate, as it was called, and we called them navvies, and they dug. Well, 100 years later, we'd invented what the Americans call the steam shovel, and we call the bulldozer, and now the JCB, and it does the digging. And nobody is saying, isn't it awful? Why can't those poor Irishmen be digging canals? We say, thank goodness. Nobody has to do that anymore. Any more than, they have to use an axe to down a tree. There's a chainsaw would do it. So very often we just have to think about all the tasks that are boring and repetitive and require concentration without creativity. And that those will go very fast. But reading faces, humor, yes, does seem unlikely.
So the reading and diagnostics and analysis is basically machine learning.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about generative AI, and maybe the one that everybody is most familiar with from the media of ChatGPT.
Yes.
How do you imagine, as a writer, this might affect your own attention to how you want to plough a different furrow to someone who can reproduce a simulacrum of a version of Greek myth?
So it's a very good question. So when Peter says generative AI, if you're not familiar with the phrase, it means literally that which generates something. So rather than just answering a question, it can draw a picture, paint a painting. I have on here, if we had so I could show you, I got AI about a year ago to do some Edward Degas paintings of myself, and there I am in a tutu, like a ballet, one of his ballet dances. It's absolutely astonishing because the painterliness is so exact. And Zabaran, who is a Spanish painter I much admire, I got them to do some still lives in the style of Zabaran, and I look at them and I'm absolutely amazed. And music, of course, can compose melodies, very banal melodies, but then so can humans compose banal melodies. And it can write limericks and poems which sort of follow the rules of poetry, but don't obviously approximate art in any way. And they can imitate voices. So I was sent a year or so ago by a company who thought that I'd be thrilled, a piece of a documentary with myself and with me doing the narration for the documentary. It was a documentary about the Dutch underground in Holland during the Second World War, deliberately chosen so, because in the commentary I'm using a lot of Dutch names and German names. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was the governor of the Netherlands.
You mean you would have passed the Dutch test?
I would have passed the Dutch and German test, but particularly because they said to me quite openly that what they used as the data set on which to base this AI voice were the 7 Harry Potter books that I narrated in the 90s and early 2000s. So they took those, they took the MP3, the files of those, and used that to build a voice. But those stories don't contain German or Dutch names, so it was, to show that it wasn't just a mashing up sounds, it was using the voice and it fooled my mother. I played it to my mother. She said, "I don't remember you doing that one." I said, "Yeah, how do I sound in that?" She said, "You sound good, actually." Yeah. Anyway, it was about a year and a half ago that I got sent this. So I sent it to my agent. My agent freaked out. And I'm not claiming I'm responsible for it, but my American agents then got excited by it, and they met with other agents in America and with SAG-AFTRA, which is the Screen Actors Guild, SAG, and AFTRA, the Association of Film and Radio and Television Actors. And there was a strike. And one of the elements of the strike was to control AI reproductions of actors' voices and likenesses, because they also have our likenesses. When I did, as long ago as I did a film of The Hobbit, or two of the trilogy down in New Zealand, and one of the first things all the actors had to do was to stand on this like enormous turntable, like a record player turntable, in this kind of canister that was filled with digital cameras. There must have been like 500 or 600 digital cameras, and you had to keep still and go round and round and round, and it would take hundreds and hundreds of shots. And from that moment on, Peter Jackson and his digital company, Weta, owned your likeness. They had it in 3D and could do anything with it, anything. Peter would boast about this. Say, "Oh yeah, I could get you snorting cocaine of a prostitute's nipples." Okay, well, you sound very pleased about this. And this is when I first became aware, or first properly thought. A lot of us have been aware of the idea that AI and any kinds of, even earlier CGI and digital manipulation can make us believe things that aren't true. But the corollary to that is almost more frightening. It makes us stop believing in things that are true. So when you say something that has happened and is a fact, it's terribly easy for someone to deny it and say, "No, that's just AI. Prove it. Prove it isn't AI. I was never there," even though it's a photograph, even though it's a voice recording. And that's as worrying as any other part of it. But yeah, that's generative AI. It's making stuff.
That's one of the alarms. Another alarm, I'm presuming, is that we have no way of controlling it or regulating it or managing it or even taxing it in a coherent way.
Yeah.
So, Stephen, what is the proper human response to that?
The first thing, I suppose, is we have to be realistic about what the real threats are. I've said before, and I still think it's a pretty apt image. The human family is sitting on a beach, making sandcastles, playing beach cricket, with its back to the sea. And there is a tsunami on the horizon. It's a massive tsunami coming towards us, and it's a confluence of different other tidal waves. The tidal wave of robotics, of bio-augmentation, of brain-computer interfacing, where our brains control the computer and guidance systems and anything digital, but also digital systems can control our brains, can see what we see, can operate our eyes and our hands. Genomics and gene editing, huge. New materials, nanomaterials, nanotubes, and so on. Quantum computing, goodbye to silicon, hello to gallium arsenide and other materials, and to quantum computing. Now, all these combined together, as well as machine learning and so on, and AI, into this, and we have still got our backs to the sea. That is the main problem. There's the odd person looking over and said, we'd better have a conference in Bletchley, or we'd better talk about it at Davos next year. But that's not quite the same as really understanding what's coming towards us. Most people would say, if this AI is as powerful as claimed, then surely it's very important that it should have baked into it what Asimov would call a prime directive. The science fiction writers were all there before us. And the prime directive in the laws of robotics are, of course, first, they mustn't harm any humans, and so on. There are 3 laws of robotics, and you can imagine prime directives. It's taken us hundreds of years to believe that women are equal to men, that people of all colors are equal to each other. The very basic tenets of human rights and equality and free and open speech and assembly have taken us a long time to come to, but we believe they are fundamental to human happiness and to the future of our species. So we would want to bake those in to our AI. But that completely ignores the fact that China and Russia have AI systems, and their ethical frameworks are entirely different to ours. They want to bake in that a citizen's duty is to report his neighbor if they happen to make a joke about the supreme leader, or they doubt the efficacy of the state. Totally different. And saying that, well, they're separate is like saying if I pee into the English Channel, it can't get into the Pacific. There's only one ocean on Earth, as any astronaut will tell you. There's just one ocean. There's just one internet. There's just one technology, one discourse, really, that humanity faces. It has different accents and flavors, but the idea that we can control ours and that somehow this will work is I'm afraid, foolish and naive. And so the words I always use about AI and the coming technology are thrilling and chilling. It's both those things. The thrilling part is Demis Hassibis, who's the great master of AI from this country, a British genius at chess when he was a child, and he was the one who developed what Google then bought, the AlphaGo that beat the Go champion, which was a hugely significant landmark in AI, way before anybody thought it was possible. Go is almost infinitely more complex than chess, and chess is complex enough, as is famously understood, and this was Claude Shannon. It's called a Shannon number. I mentioned him as the Bell Labs fellow. There are more possible games of chess than there are atoms in the observable universe. That's the complexity of chess, and Go is more complex than that. So mastering Go was good. Anyway, he now has a company called AlphaFold, and if there are any doctors or physiologists around you, or biochemists, you will know that one of the most complex things that we know outside the human brain itself is the structure of proteins. Proteins are built by amino acids, as I'm sure you remember from school, and they are extraordinarily complex in their structure, far beyond the range of classical computers, i.e. the kinds of computers we have now. But AI with quantum computing might solve the problem of proteins, which would solve dementia. It would really make such extraordinary inroads into medicine that it's quite conceivable that, and this is often said at AI conferences, the first human being to live to 200 is already alive. Some child who's now 4 won't die till they're 200. It's very possible. So there's that side of it, which is, again, both thrilling and chilling. It gives us all these questions about universal basic incomes and how we redesign the world of work. But one thing, if you've read popular social anthropologists and anthropologists like Noel Yuval Harari, for example, whose *Sapiens* was enormously popular, you will remember that work is not natural to us. It's very new. This idea that we get up, we go to work, we have an employer, this is all fantastically recent in our history. The idea that it is somehow the natural way is nonsense. And we have to recalibrate our thinking about why we're on this planet, what we're doing here, what will fulfill us. Not just what fattens a paycheck, gets us a house in Carshalton with a lawn and a garage, pays school fees or whatever it is that we have ambitions for. But what personally makes us fulfilled? What will we put here to do that will give us pleasure, that will allow us to express the ultimate nature of who we are in what we love, what we feel, what we do, what we hope, what we can achieve? And most of what we do militates against that. We have to fight all the battles we fight to get to work, to control the children, to do this, to do that. It is possible that we could get so much of that out of the way and begin to concentrate on who we are, on being a kind of artist, not in the sense of necessarily painting, but in doing what artists do in their lives, which is questioning, examining, exulting, experimenting, living to an absolute depth that very few of us are ever able to do.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to just move you on. Thank you for all of that. I want to move you on because it seems it would be a missed opportunity not to explore one of our other big topics with you here. Because here we are, a passionate atheist and a militant agnostic, sitting in this beautiful church, but we're also sitting 35 meters from Maggie Hambling's sculpture.
Conversation with Oscar.
A conversation with Oscar Wilde. We're sitting with our backs to him, back to back. It feels like a good place to be. And in this context, and I realize it's not your problem, but I would like you to address it, can you speak a little to why monotheistic religions have such a big problem with homosexuality?
It's something one would like to ask quite a few bishops, priests, and others. It's a strange thing because I think even in the more evangelical wings of Christianity, and I'm speaking about Christianity as the monotheism here first, and certainly in the more doctrinally Catholic ends, i.e. from high to low, if you speak doctrinally of the church, I would say that within the body of those churches and its ministries, there is a higher proportion of gay people than there is outside anything other than air stewards and my profession, possibly. It is a peculiar thing that the monotheistic religions, when they arose, and they arose in the same place, a place of deep, deep despair at the moment. It is strange when you stand in Jerusalem, as I have, at the Western Wall, for example, which is the base of Solomon's Temple and the most holy place for the Jews, of which I'm half a Jew, though I'm not religiously so, but it's interesting to go there and you see the Wailing Wall thing, the Western Wall, the banging the head, the putting of the prayers, because that's where Solomon's Temple was. It's where the Ark of the Covenant was, in the most important place in Jewry, in the Judaic religion, rather. But above it, literally built on top of it, is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where Muhammad ascended into heaven, the second most holy place in all Islam. And you throw a cricket ball and you hit the Via Dolorosa, which is the path Christ took on his way to be crucified. All within, I mean, it's just over there. And this is the wall. The three biggest religions on earth all sprang from the same place in the desert, which now is seeping blood and agony in the most desperate way. There is something very peculiar about this place and what it's given the world. On the one hand, there's a majesty and glory to what it's created. There is beauty in the Bible and in the Quran and in the old, obviously the Talmud and the Jewish texts. There is beauty, but there is also an extraordinary history of intolerance given their connections. One of the things that it's very hard for Jewish people to hear and very hard for Islamic people to hear is that if you're anti-Semitic, technically it means you hate Arabs as well as Jews, because the word Semitic means of Shem. Shem, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, you remember, were the children of Noah. And Shem's line included Abraham, or Ibrahim, as the Arabs would call him, and he had his son Ishmael. And Ishmael went off. He was expelled, as it were, and he founded the Arab race. And from the seed of Abraham came Isaac and his son Jacob, who changed his name to Israel. And Jacob had 12 children, Dan, Asher, Reuben, the tribes of Israel, and of course famously Joseph and Benjamin, the youngest. And so you have Israel and Ishmael, cousins. And they are the Jews and the Arabs. They are the same people. It's maddening, the hatred that can happen. But it's only in families, isn't it? Yeah, thank you. So, and of course, Christianity is sprang from that Abrahamic tradition, and Christ was stem of Jesse, the father of David. So all the way from the King David and Solomon and that line. So you have these religions, and they have in common an absolutism that doesn't seem to be there in the pagan religions. Certainly if you look for the 4,500 odd years of the Egyptian civilization and its religion, it had many gods, you know, Anubis and Ra, and the rather wonderful one, have you heard of? It's very beautiful. Was the first sound made. It was an ejaculation from the God who made the world. He ejaculated the world and went, ha. Literally, that is his name. Ha, H-U. You look it up. It's very pleasing. Anyway, they had all those gods. And then one of them, Akhenaten, you remember, because, you know, Philip Glass wrote the opera about it. One of them, Akhenaten, decided there was only one God, that Ra, the sun god, would be the only God. And he created this, and the priests got very annoyed with him, and they eventually killed him, and that was the end of that experiment. And they went back to Anubis and Ra and all the others. But and the Greeks had their you know, dodecathon, their 12 on Olympus, plus all the nymphs. And mostly around the world, animism was the religion, where you feel that living things like trees and rivers, which you consider living, which is a very reasonable thing to consider, and that they all are a god as well. They have a spirit, and that they must be placated, which is kind of true. If you live in nature, you have to placate nature. You have to appease it and love it, respect it, bow before it to some extent, speak to it, all those things. And I think these are wonderfully admirable religions. But then the others, these ones, are about control. And control is the most important thing that the priests and hierophants and the caste of clerics and whatever you want to call them, they had to control information, but also behavior. And the most aberrant behavior for them, for some reason, was behavior that exhibited an individualism and a separateness from the family that they could control. They could baptize or circumcise or in any other way own a child. But a homosexual couple didn't have children. They lived their own life, and they didn't need the services of the church to make them whole. And maybe that's part of their argument. I don't know. It is extraordinary how the churches are more obsessed with sex than ordinary people are. It really is. When a church person, usually, I mean, there are many decent and wonderful ones whom one would accept from this, but when they say moral, they usually mean something to do with the genitals. Now, there is no reason or logic behind that. If you were to do what the philosopher does, to suggest a Martian is looking down on our planet, and they see cruelty, abuse, torture, betrayal, meanness, exploitation, all the terrible things humans do. And they also see that some people rub parts of their bodies against each other, and it gives them enormous pleasure, and that they fall in love with each other. And they're then asked, which of the behaviors do you think has most exercised and annoyed the leaders of moral thought of our people? And they'd say, well, obviously, it's the abuse and the cruelty and the exploitation. No, it's not. And it's there in our language, the F word and everything else, all the words that refer to perfectly normal operations and functions of the human body are taboo, but the things that ought to be taboo, it was murder in the traffic the other day. Murder? That's the worst thing humans do. How can you use the word murder in vain, lightly? Oh, and yet we do. Oh, it was torture. Torture? But use the word for defecation or copulation in the normal Saxon word for it, and I'm still not using it in the church out of respect for the fact that this is the world we live in. But the logic of it defies belief. It is absurd. And the problem, and we're living in a time when apparently sex education is to be denied to a certain age, and I don't have children, it's not my business in a sense, but it would be good to imagine that children could grow up not thinking that sex was dirty and that was secret and that it was something that was to be kept aside from conversation and that it was, it was part of what is bad about being human. I mean, that is the most extraordinary thing in Genesis, is when God says the brilliant words to Adam. Adam, he's walking in the cool of the evening, if you remember, and then he sees Adam and Eve, who have eaten the fruit whereof he spake, thou shouldst not eat, and they cover themselves up with fig leaves, famously. And he says, why are you wearing fig leaves? And they said, well, we were naked and we were ashamed. And God says to them, who told you you were naked? And that is a question we still have to. Who told us there was such a thing as naked? We are what we are. An animal doesn't think it's naked. Oh my goodness, says a tree frog. I must cover myself up. Somehow we became ashamed of who we were. It's the oddest thing about us. And maybe we should return to AI. That's one of the things AI will never be able to pass in the Turing test. And that is what it's embarrassed by, what it's ashamed by, what it's guilty about. When it goes to bed at night, what does it go, oh, why did I do that? Oh my God, I was such a bad AI, But every one of us does that as we go to bed. We check over, oh God, I got drunk, I said that. Did I say that? Oh my God, no. Did they say, I didn't do this, I've got to do this tomorrow. This whole sort of burden that is the dark side of the consciousness and the creativity that we are gifted as humans. We have to cope with the other side. And maybe grappling with that and dealing with that. There was a belief in the 1950s on from the 20s, thanks to the Viennese school and others, that moral philosophy was a finished subject, that there was no need for ethics and morals anymore. Well, suddenly, more than ever, ethics is the biggest subject in philosophy, and the one that we should maybe all get excited by.
Stephen, thank you. You're wonderful, and that was thrilling, and will set us up for the next hour. Can I... Can I just announce a couple of things? Stephen is in the middle of filming the second season of Neil Gaiman's Sandman, and has to go because he's filming at whatever stroke of dawn he's doing. But he has very kindly signed 50 copies of his books, which is actually quite unusual. And they are available downstairs at the bookshop. So whilst he isn't there to sign them, the books are there to sign. I should also say, just from my own behalf, thank you to Chris Denton and Caroline Malloy and the whole team here, who are just fantastic to work with and who have made this evening possible. I would also like to thank all the people who bought a tree as part of this evening. Thank you for contributing to the European Festival's Forest. You are but 12 trees away from a full acre, which would make this whole event carbon neutral. So if you fancy going home and just buying another one, that'd be just wonderful. We're here now enough to say thank you and good night to Stephen, and then to reconvene downstairs in 10 minutes around the tables which are laid out. Can I institute a kind of a new, I'm very wary of saying rule or law, but a new idea. Protocol, thank you. When you go downstairs, if you've come with 4 or 6 people, please just sit with 4 or 6 people. If you've come on your own or with one other person, just join whichever table you'd like to join. The idea is that there is another hour where people can pick up all these ideas and keep talking about them happily and together. But there's an added bit to this, which I'd love you to consider after tonight, maybe later at home when you're not lying in bed worrying about what you might have said, or tomorrow, or whenever. Would you, if you have had a really interesting conversation and really want to contribute something to the conversation, would you email me? I am, very simply for today, marketing@smitf.org, and tell me how your conversation went. And what I'd like to do when I come to write up this evening and try and retell some of the stories that Stephen's told, include as many observations and reflections and stories that you have, because this really should be an absolutely participatory and mutualizing experience. And you were the very first people to do it, so please help me get it right. Thank you very much for being such a wonderful audience. Thank you all around the world for staying with us, and most of all, Stephen, thank you. Thank you.